Deep in the fog-shrouded coast of Maine, 18-year-old Emma stood at the gates of Riverside Asylum, clutching the only thing the world had left her, a single rusted key. She had spent 5 years behind those sterile walls, her mind shattered, her past erased. The social worker's words were cold and final. Nobody left you anything. Just this key to an abandoned beach house. Emma had no memory of family, no memory of who she had been before the darkness consumed her. But when she finally reached the weathered house perched on the isolated shore, she found fresh footprints in the sand and a door that should have been sealed for years. Inside, a table was set for 2, candles recently burned. Someone had been living in her inheritance, waiting. What truth had they been guarding in that house by the sea? What secret was worth 5 years of Emma's stolen memories? The air in the discharge office of Riverside Asylum was sterile and cold, smelling of antiseptic and the faint bitter scent of institutional coffee that had been burning on a hot plate for too many hours. Emma sat perfectly still on a hard plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap, a posture she had learned over 5 long years within these walls. At 18 years old, she was a young woman carved from silence and uncertainty. Her dark hair, cut short and practical by asylum staff just yesterday, framed a pale face marked by eyes that held a profound, searching emptiness. Those eyes, a deep brown that might have once sparkled with youth and joy, now carried the weight of fragmented memories she could not trust, and a past that existed only as shadows in her fractured mind. She wore the clothes they had given her for release, a simple gray sweater, faded jeans that were slightly too large, and worn sneakers. Everything about her was clean, functional, and utterly devoid of personality, as if the asylum had scrubbed away not just her illness but her very identity. Across the metal desk sat Miss Hartley, the social worker assigned to her case, a woman whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of bureaucratic exhaustion. She did not look at Emma as she shuffled through paperwork, her movements mechanical and detached. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, drained of any warmth or human connection. "Emma Whitmore," she said, reading from a file, "your treatment has been deemed complete. You are being released into independent living." She pushed a single rusted key across the desk, the sound of metal scraping against metal harsh in the quiet room. Next to it, she placed a slip of paper with an address written in faded ink. "This is all that was left for you. A property on the coast of Maine, Tidecrest House, Saltmere Cove. Nobody left you anything else. No family came forward. No inheritance except this key to an abandoned beach house." Emma stared at the key, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. The metal was cold and rough against her skin, its surface pitted with age and salt corrosion. "I don't understand," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who left it to me?" Miss Hartley's expression did not change. "The records are incomplete. The property was held in trust. That's all I know." She closed the file with a snap. "A bus ticket has been purchased for you. You leave in 2 hours." Emma had 1,000 questions, but she could see in the social worker's cold eyes that none of them would be answered here. She took the key and the address and stood on unsteady legs. An hour later, she sat on a Greyhound bus heading north along the coast, her small canvas bag holding everything she owned, 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and the mysterious key. As the asylum faded behind her, Emma pressed her forehead against the cool window and watched the landscape change from institutional gray to the wild, untamed beauty of the Maine coastline. She tried to remember anything before the asylum, before the darkness that had swallowed her mind when she was only 13 years old. There were fragments, fleeting images that dissolved like smoke when she tried to grasp them, the sound of waves, a woman's laughter, the scent of salt and roses, but none of it formed a coherent whole. She had no memory of family, no anchor to a past that must have existed. The emptiness was vast and terrifying, a void where her childhood should have been. 5 years of sterile routine, of therapy sessions where she spoke to doctors who looked at her with clinical detachment, of nights spent staring at white ceilings and wondering who she had been before the break. Now she was free, heading toward a house she did not remember, left to her by people whose faces she could not recall. The key felt heavy in her pocket, a weight of secrets and unanswered questions. As the bus carried her toward an unknown future, Emma wondered if the abandoned house by the sea held the truth she had been searching for, or if it was just another empty room in a life built on forgotten foundations. The bus shuddered to a stop at the edge of Saltmere Cove, just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting the small coastal town in a golden amber light that seemed both beautiful and melancholic. Emma stepped down onto the cracked pavement, her canvas bag clutched tightly in one hand, and breathed in the sharp, bracing scent of salt air, mixed with the faint aroma of fish and weathered wood. The town was small, little more than a single main street lined with buildings that looked as though they had been standing for 100 years, their paint peeled by wind and sea spray. Their foundations settled deep into the rocky Maine soil. There was a general store with a hand-painted sign, a diner with fogged windows, a post office that doubled as a bait shop, and a scattering of weathered homes climbing the hillside like barnacles clinging to a ship's hull. As Emma walked slowly down the main street, her footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk, she became aware of eyes upon her. An old man sitting on a bench outside the diner lowered his newspaper and stared, his weathered face registering something that looked disturbingly like recognition, followed immediately by what could only be described as fear. A woman hanging laundry in her front yard froze mid-motion, a white sheet clutched in her hands, her mouth forming a small circle of surprise. Two teenagers on bicycles slowed as they passed her, their heads turning to follow her progress, whispering urgently to each other before pedaling away with sudden haste. The sensation was unsettling, a crawling awareness that she was not anonymous here, that somehow these strangers knew her or knew of her in ways she could not begin to understand. Emma pushed open the door to the general store, a bell chiming overhead with a cheerful sound that felt at odds with the oppressive atmosphere. Inside, the store smelled of old wood, coffee beans, and the musty scent of newspapers. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with a face like cracked leather, his white hair thin and carefully combed, his blue eyes sharp despite his age. He looked up as she entered, and Emma saw it again, that flicker of recognition, that shadow of something darker crossing his features. "Excuse me," Emma said, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet store. "I'm looking for directions to Tidecrest House." The silence that followed was profound and heavy, as if all the air had been suddenly sucked from the room. The shopkeeper's hands, which had been arranging cans on a shelf, stilled completely. He did not turn to face her immediately, but stood frozen, his back rigid with tension. When he finally did turn, his expression was carefully neutral, a mask that did not quite conceal the conflict beneath. "Tidecrest," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. "You're looking for Tidecrest House." It was not a question. "Yes," Emma said, stepping closer to the counter. "I have the address. Tidecrest House, Cliff Road past the old lighthouse. Can you tell me how to get there?" The shopkeeper studied her face for a long moment, his gaze moving over her features with an intensity that made her want to look away. "That house," he said finally, his voice rough and deliberate, "has been dark for years, abandoned. Nobody's lived there since." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Since when?" Emma pressed, her heart beginning to beat faster. The old man shook his head slowly. "Long time. 13 years, maybe more. Place is probably falling apart by now. Why would a young girl like you want to go out there?" There was something in his tone, a warning wrapped in concern, but Emma also saw something else in his pale blue eyes, a flicker of untruth, a careful avoidance of her direct gaze. He was lying, or at least not telling her the complete truth. She could feel it in the way his hands gripped the edge of the counter, in the tightness of his shoulders, in the way he glanced toward the window as if checking to see who might be watching. "I inherited it," Emma said quietly. "It was left to me." The shopkeeper's face went pale, and for a moment Emma thought he might refuse to help her at all. But then he seemed to collect himself, reaching beneath the counter to pull out a faded map of the area. "Cliff Road," he said, his finger tracing a line along the coast. "Follow it north for about 3 miles. You'll see the old lighthouse, and just beyond it, there's a path down to the point. The house sits on the rocks overlooking the water." He pushed the map toward her. "But miss, if I were you, I'd turn around and go back wherever you came from. Some places are better left alone." Emma left the general store with the map clutched in her hand and the shopkeeper's warning echoing in her mind, but she did not turn back. The road north out of Saltmere Cove was narrow and winding, little more than 2 lanes of cracked asphalt that hugged the coastline with a precarious intimacy. To her left, the land rose in gentle hills covered with wind-bent pines and wild beach grass that whispered secrets in the constant breeze. To her right, The Atlantic Ocean stretched endless and gray, its surface churned by wind into white-capped waves that crashed against black rocks with a rhythmic violence that was both beautiful and terrible. The afternoon light was fading now, the sun sinking lower toward the horizon and painting the sky in shades of amber and deep purple, casting long shadows across the landscape. As she walked, the isolation grew more profound with each step. The last house she passed was a small cottage nearly a mile back, its windows dark and shuttered against the coming night. The road itself seemed to narrow, the pavement giving way to packed gravel and sand, and the sound of her footsteps was swallowed by the roar of the surf and the cry of gulls wheeling overhead. After what felt like an eternity but was likely only 40 minutes of steady walking, Emma saw the old lighthouse the shopkeeper had mentioned, a tall white tower standing sentinel on a rocky promontory, its paint peeling and its light long extinguished. Just beyond it, exactly as the map had indicated, a narrow path diverged from the main road, winding down through tall grass and over weathered wooden planks toward a point of land that jutted out into the sea like a defiant finger. Emma's breath caught in her throat as Tidecrest House came into view. It was a Victorian structure of breathtaking beauty, 3 stories tall, with a steeply pitched roof, elaborate gingerbread trim along the eaves, and a wraparound porch that faced the ocean with a kind of elegant defiance. The house was painted a soft gray-blue, the color of storm clouds over water, with white trim that had faded and chipped, but still held traces of its former grandeur. Tall windows, some with their original wavy glass intact, gazed out over the rocks like knowing eyes. A stone chimney rose from the center of the structure, and a widow's walk crowned the roof, a small railed platform where sailors' wives had once watched for ships that would never return. The house perched on a rocky outcrop surrounded on 3 sides by crashing waves, accessible only by the narrow path Emma now walked, and the isolation was complete and profound. But something was wrong. As Emma drew closer, her steps slowing, she realized with a cold shock that this house did not look abandoned. The windows were not broken or boarded. The porch, though weathered, was intact and clear of debris. The front door, a heavy oak structure with an oval window of stained glass depicting a lighthouse and waves, showed no signs of rot or damage. This was not a house that had sat empty for 13 years. This was a house that had been maintained, cared for, lived in. Emma's heart began to pound as she noticed other details that confirmed her suspicion. The flower boxes beneath the front windows, though empty now in the late autumn chill, showed evidence of recent soil and the dried stems of summer blooms. The path leading to the front door was worn smooth, not overgrown with the wild grass that should have reclaimed it years ago. And then she saw them, and her blood turned to ice, fresh footprints in the damp sand near the base of the porch steps, leading from the beach up to the front door. They were recent, made within hours, the edges still crisp and defined. Someone had walked this path today, had climbed these steps, had entered this house that was supposed to be abandoned and forgotten. Emma's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and withdrew the rusted key, its weight suddenly feeling ominous and heavy. The metal was cold against her palm, and she stared at it as if it were a living thing, a connection to a past she could not remember and a present that made no sense. The house loomed before her, beautiful and terrible, its windows dark but somehow watchful, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks seemed to grow louder, more insistent, like a warning she could not quite understand. Emma stood before the heavy oak door for a long moment, the rusted key held in her trembling hand, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as fear and determination warred within her. The stained glass window in the door depicted a lighthouse standing firm against stylized waves, and through it she could see only darkness, a void that seemed to pulse with secrets and danger. With a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying, she inserted the key into the lock, and despite the rust and age of the metal, it turned smoothly, too smoothly, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled and maintained. The door swung inward on silent hinges, and Emma stepped across the threshold into a house that stole her breath and shattered every expectation she had carried with her. The interior was not abandoned, not even close. She stood in a wide entrance hall with gleaming hardwood floors that showed the soft patina of regular care, not the dull film of years of dust and neglect. To her left, an elegant staircase curved upward to the second floor, its banister polished and smooth beneath her fingers as she reached out instinctively to steady herself. To her right, Through an arched doorway, she could see a living room furnished with comfortable chairs, a sofa covered in a faded floral pattern, and bookshelves lined with volumes that stood straight and orderly. But it was the fireplace that held her attention and sent a spike of cold fear through her chest. A stone hearth dominated one wall, and within it lay the remains of a recent fire, the ashes still holding faint glimmers of orange ember, the smell of wood smoke fresh and unmistakable in the air. Someone had been here today, perhaps within the last few hours, had sat in this room and warmed themselves by this fire. Emma moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the wooden floors, her senses hyper-alert to every creak and whisper of sound. The rooms were clean, almost obsessively so, with no dust on the furniture, no cobwebs in the corners, no signs of decay or abandonment. In the kitchen, she found a sink free of grime, cabinets stocked with dishes and glasses, and a small table set beneath a window that looked out over the dark ocean. But it was what sat on that table that made her heart stop completely. A single piece of cream-colored stationery folded once, with her name written on the outside in an elegant flowing script. With hands that shook so badly she could barely control them, Emma unfolded the note and read the words written there in black ink. "Welcome home, Emma. I knew you would come back." The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message both welcoming and deeply unsettling, and Emma felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Someone knew she was coming, had prepared for her arrival, had been waiting for her. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the house. The hallway was lined with closed doors, and she opened them one by one. A bathroom with vintage fixtures and clean towels hanging on a rack, a study filled with books and papers, a master bedroom with a large bed covered in a dusty quilt, and then she found it, the room at the end of the hall, and when she pushed open the door she nearly cried out in shock and recognition. It was a bedroom prepared for a young woman, for someone exactly her age. The bed was made with fresh white linens that still held the crisp scent of recent laundering. On the dresser sat a hairbrush, a small mirror, and a collection of simple jewelry. The closet door stood slightly ajar, and when Emma looked inside she found clothes hanging neatly on hangers. Sweaters, jeans, dresses, all in styles that would suit her, all in sizes that would fit her perfectly. On the nightstand, beside the bed sat a leather-bound journal, its cover worn but well cared for, and a fountain pen resting across its surface. Emma picked up the journal with trembling fingers and opened it to the first page, where a single sentence was written in that same elegant script, "For Emma, when she is ready to remember." Emma did not sleep that night, could not sleep, though exhaustion pulled at her limbs and made her eyes burn with fatigue. She lay in the bed that had been prepared for her, staring at the ceiling as shadows moved across it like living things, cast by the moon through the tall windows and the branches of wind-bent trees outside. Every creak of the old house settling, every groan of wood adjusting to the temperature change as night deepened, every distant crash of waves against the rocks below sent her heart racing and her body rigid with fear. She was not alone in this house, not truly, even though her cautious search of every room, every closet, every possible hiding place had revealed no other living presence. But someone had been here, was perhaps watching even now, and the weight of unseen eyes felt like a physical pressure against her skin. When the darkness became too oppressive, when the not knowing became worse than whatever truth she might discover, Emma rose from the bed and began to explore the house more thoroughly. Moving through the rooms with a candle she had found in the kitchen, its flickering light casting dancing shadows that made the familiar unfamiliar and turned ordinary objects into potential threats. She found the pantry off the kitchen stocked with food, canned goods arranged neatly on shelves, dry pasta in glass jars, coffee and tea in airtight containers, even fresh bread in a wooden box that could not be more than 2 days old. Someone had provisioned this house for habitation, had anticipated needs, and met them with careful planning. In the living room, as she moved slowly along the walls, examining every detail by candlelight, she began to notice the photographs. They hung in simple wooden frames, some on the walls, others arranged on side tables and the mantel above the fireplace, and they told a story she did not remember but felt in the deepest parts of her being. There was a young couple in their late 20s or early 30s, photographed on this very beach with the house visible in the background. A tall man with kind eyes and dark hair, his arm around a beautiful woman, with a warm smile, and the same dark hair that Emma saw in her own reflection. They looked happy, deeply in love, their faces radiating a joy that seemed to fill the photograph with light. In another frame, the couple stood with a little girl, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, who held their hands between them as all three faced the camera. The child had dark curls and enormous brown eyes, and she was laughing at something outside the frame, her face alight with pure, unself-conscious delight. Emma's hands began to shake as she studied that child's face, as she noted the familiar curve of the cheek, the shape of the eyes, the small dimple in the left corner of the mouth that she herself possessed. There were more photographs, the little girl building sandcastles, the little girl being lifted high in the man's strong arms, the little girl sleeping peacefully in the woman's lap, the little girl blowing out candles on a birthday cake. Emma moved along the wall as if in a trance, her breathing shallow, her vision beginning to blur with tears she did not understand. And then she reached the mantel, and there, in a silver frame that caught and reflected her candlelight, was a photograph that brought her to her knees. A portrait of the little girl, perhaps 5 years old. Sitting on the porch of this very house, the child wore a white dress with blue flowers, and her hair was pulled back with a ribbon. She smiled directly at the camera with absolute trust and innocence, and there was no doubt, no possibility of coincidence or mistake. The face in that photograph was Emma's own childhood face, younger and happier and whole. A version of herself that existed before the darkness, before the asylum, before the forgetting. She was staring at her own past, at a life she could not remember, at parents whose faces she did not know but whose loss she suddenly felt like a physical wound in her chest. The morning light came harsh and unforgiving through the tall windows, finding Emma still on the floor beside the mantel, her back against the stone hearth, the silver-framed photograph clutched in her hands. She had spent the remainder of the night there, unable to move, staring at her own childhood face and trying desperately to remember something, anything, about the people in the photographs. About the life that had clearly been hers. Her body ached from the hard floor, and her eyes felt gritty and swollen from tears she had not realized she was crying, but the exhaustion was almost welcome. A physical manifestation of the emotional devastation that threatened to overwhelm her completely. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks had become a constant rhythm, almost comforting in its predictability, and the house had settled into the quiet creaks and whispers of an old structure waking to daylight. Emma was just considering whether she had the strength to rise, to face another day of questions without answers, when a sharp knock at the front door sent her heart hammering and brought her instantly to her feet, the photograph still gripped tightly in her hands. She moved to the window and peered cautiously through the lace curtains, half expecting to see the mysterious occupant who had prepared the house, perhaps someone sinister or threatening. But instead she saw an elderly woman standing on the porch, a basket covered with a checkered cloth held in her weathered hands. The woman was perhaps in her middle 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and a face that spoke of a lifetime spent near the sea, lined and weathered but kind. She wore a simple wool cardigan over a cotton dress and sturdy practical shoes, and there was something about her posture, patient but determined, that suggested she would wait as long as necessary for the door to open. Emma hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door and pulling it open, and the woman's face transformed with an emotion so profound and complex that Emma could not name it: relief, sorrow, joy, and something that looked almost like pain, all warring for dominance in her pale blue eyes. "Emma," the woman said softly, and there was such warmth in the single word that Emma felt tears spring to her eyes again. "Oh, my dear child, you came home." The woman seemed to catch herself, to realize that her familiarity might be frightening or unwelcome, and she stepped back slightly, her expression shifting to something more careful and controlled. "Forgive me," she said, her voice gentling. "I'm Margaret Brennan. I live about a quarter-mile down the beach, the cottage with the blue shutters. I saw smoke from your chimney last night and thought I should come check on you." She lifted the basket slightly. "I brought fresh bread. I thought you might need something warm after your journey." Emma found her voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. "You know who I am." It was not a question. Margaret's expression flickered with something that might have been guilt or sadness, and she nodded slowly. "I knew your parents, dear. I knew you when you were very small. Your mother, Sarah, she asked me to watch over this place after." She paused, choosing her words with visible care. "After she was gone. She made me promise to keep it ready, to wait for you. She said you would come back when the time was right, when you were ready." The words hung in the salt air between them, heavy with implications and unspoken truths, and Emma felt her knees weaken as the reality began to settle over her like a shroud. This woman had known her mother, had known her as a child, had been keeping this house like a shrine or a sanctuary, waiting 13 years for Emma to return to a home she could not remember. Emma invited Margaret inside, her hands still trembling as she set the silver-framed photograph back on the mantel, and the elderly woman moved through the house with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours within these walls, her eyes touching on objects and spaces with a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Emma had found the mysterious note the night before, and Margaret poured tea from a pot she seemed to know exactly where to find, her movements practiced and sure. The bread she had brought was still warm, and she cut thick slices with a knife from the drawer, spreading butter with the care of someone performing a ritual of comfort and normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. "Your parents," Margaret began, her voice soft and measured, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup as if drawing strength from its warmth, "were remarkable people, Emma. Your father, David Whitmore, was a research scientist, brilliant and dedicated. Your mother, Sarah, was a medical doctor, specializing in neurology and cognitive therapy. They worked together at a private research facility, developing treatments for traumatic memory disorders and psychological trauma. They were pioneers in their field, respected and admired, and they were deeply, profoundly in love." She paused, her eyes distant as if seeing into the past. "This house was filled with joy when you lived here. You were their whole world, their little girl, so bright and curious and full of life. I would come visit sometimes, and Sarah would make tea just like this, and you would sit right where you are now, telling me stories about the treasures you found on the beach, the shells and sea glass you collected like precious jewels. Your laughter, Emma, it filled every room." Margaret's expression clouded then, and her hands tightened around the cup until her knuckles went white. "But then, 13 years ago, something changed. Your parents became worried, frightened even. I noticed them having urgent conversations that would stop abruptly when I arrived. Your father started spending long hours locked in his study upstairs, and your mother seemed constantly watching the road, as if expecting someone unwelcome. They were working on something important, something that others wanted, and they had discovered something they should not have discovered." She looked directly at Emma now, her pale blue eyes intense and pleading. "One night, a terrible night in late autumn, something happened in this house. I don't know all the details, Emma, because I was not here, but I know that by morning your parents were gone and you had vanished as well. The authorities called it a murder-suicide, said your father had lost his mind and done something terrible, but I never believed that, not for one moment. David and Sarah loved you more than life itself." Emma's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as fragments of nightmare images flickered at the edges of her consciousness, darkness, shouting. Her mother's scream, a terrible fear that had no shape or name. Margaret reached across the table and gripped Emma's hand with surprising strength. "You were found 3 days later, wandering on a beach 30 miles north, completely unresponsive, your mind locked away behind walls of trauma so severe the doctors said you might never recover. You were placed in psychiatric care, and over the years, as far as anyone knew, you had no memory of who you were or what had happened. But your mother, Emma, before that terrible night, she came to me and made me promise something. She said if anything happened to them, I was to watch over this house, to keep it ready, because you would come back. She said you were stronger than anyone knew, that the truth lived in you even if you could not remember it." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and she glanced toward the windows, as if checking for watchers in the morning light. "There are people, Emma, powerful people, who do not want you to remember what happened that night. They have reasons to keep the past buried, and they will do anything to protect their secrets." After Margaret left with another warning to be careful and a promise to return the next day, Emma stood in the quiet house feeling the weight of revelations that raised more questions than they answered. Her parents had been murdered, not lost to some tragedy of mental illness, and she had been a witness to something so terrible her mind had locked itself away to survive the trauma. But what had they discovered that was worth killing for? And who were these powerful people Margaret feared? The answers, Emma felt with a certainty that bypassed rational thought, were somewhere in this house, hidden in the same careful way the study upstairs had been maintained and the bedroom prepared. She began a systematic search, starting with the rooms she had already explored, but looking now with new eyes, searching for inconsistencies, for spaces that did not quite make sense, for the hidden places where desperate people concealed desperate secrets. The main floor revealed nothing new, nor did the second-floor bedrooms, but when Emma climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, she felt a change in the air, a charge of anticipation that made the hair on her arms stand up. The attic was a long, low-ceilinged space that ran the length of the house, its slanted walls following the pitch of the roof, and it was filled with the accumulated memories of lives lived. Old furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes of books and papers, a dressmaker's dummy standing like a ghost in the corner, and a large wooden wardrobe pushed against the far wall beneath one of the small dormer windows. Emma moved through the space slowly, examining boxes and opening trunks, finding nothing but ordinary remnants of ordinary life. Old clothes, children's toys that must have been hers, photograph albums that she could not bear to open yet. But when she reached the wardrobe, something made her pause. It was positioned oddly, pulled slightly away from the wall at an angle that seemed deliberate rather than accidental, and when she pressed her shoulder against its solid oak frame and pushed, it moved with surprising ease, sliding across the floor on hidden casters. Behind it was a door, a small narrow door built into the wall itself, its surface painted the same color as the surrounding plaster, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Emma's hands shook as she grasped the simple brass handle and pulled, and the door swung inward to reveal a space that took her breath away, a hidden study, small and windowless but meticulously organized, lined with shelves and filled with the tools of serious research. A desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers held down by stones from the beach, and the walls were covered with maps, charts, and diagrams that meant nothing to Emma but clearly represented months or years of painstaking work. But it was the files stacked on the shelves that drew her attention, thick folders bound with string and marked with a logo she had never seen before, a stylized wave circling a DNA helix. And beneath it the words, Meridian Biotech, Advancing Human Potential. Emma pulled down the first file with trembling hands and opened it to reveal page after page of technical documentation, research notes in her father's handwriting, and official correspondence on corporate letterhead. She saw references to something called Project Tidebreak, a research initiative that seemed to involve genetic modification and memory manipulation, experimental treatments that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics and legal oversight. As she rifled through more files, her father's notes became increasingly urgent, increasingly alarmed. Concerns about unauthorized human trials, about subjects who had not consented, about side effects that were being deliberately concealed. And then she found it, a journal that must have been her father's personal log, and as she flipped through the pages, she saw her own name appearing again and again in the margins, sometimes written in careful script, sometimes scrawled in what looked like panic. Next to her name, circled in red ink so heavily the pen had nearly torn through the paper, was a single word that appeared on page after page: immune. Emma spent the next 2 days consumed by her father's research, barely eating or sleeping as she tried to decipher the technical language and piece together the story hidden in those files. She learned that Meridian Biotech had hired her parents to develop a revolutionary treatment for trauma-induced memory loss, a therapy that could help victims of severe psychological damage recover without being re-traumatized by their memories. But somewhere along the way, the project had been twisted into something darker. Experiments in memory manipulation, in selective erasure and implantation, treatments that could be weaponized to control what people remembered and forgot. Her father's notes revealed his growing horror as he uncovered evidence of unauthorized trials on vulnerable populations, of corporate executives who saw the technology not as healing but as power, and his determination to expose the truth before more people were harmed. But it was the references to Emma herself that haunted her most. Notations about her unusual resistance to the experimental compounds. Observations that she seemed naturally immune to the memory manipulation techniques that worked on other subjects. Speculation that her genetic makeup held the key to understanding why some minds could not be controlled. On the third evening after Margaret's visit, as the autumn sun began its descent toward the horizon and fog rolled in from the ocean like a living thing, Emma stood at the tall windows of the living room and saw him for the first time, a figure standing motionless on the beach below the house, partially obscured by the gathering mist but unmistakably human, unmistakably watching. The figure was too far away to make out features, just a dark silhouette against the lighter gray of the fog. But there was something deliberate in the stillness, something patient and calculating that sent ice through Emma's veins. She moved quickly to the front door and out onto the porch, her heart pounding, calling out, "Who are you? What do you want?" But even as the words left her lips, the figure turned and walked calmly into the thicker fog, disappearing as if it had never existed at all. Emma ran down the path toward the beach, her feet slipping on the damp rocks. But by the time she reached the spot where the figure had stood, there was nothing, no footprints in the wet sand, no trace that anyone had been there. Except the next morning, when she walked the perimeter of the property in full daylight, she found them, fresh cigarette butts scattered near the edge of her land where it bordered the public beach access. At least a dozen of them, as if someone had spent hours standing in that exact spot, watching and smoking and waiting. The discovery filled her with a dread that went beyond simple fear. This was not random, not a curious tourist or a lost hiker. This was surveillance, patient and deliberate. And it meant that whatever secrets her father had tried to protect, whatever truth had gotten her parents killed, someone knew she was here and was watching to see what she would do. Over the following days, the figure appeared again and again, always at dusk, always in the fog, always in a slightly different location, but always watching the house with that same unnerving stillness. Emma began to feel the weight of unseen eyes constantly upon her, a paranoia that made her jump at every sound, check the locks obsessively, and sleep with a kitchen knife under her pillow. The sense of being surveyed was oppressive and constant, a psychological pressure that eroded her sense of safety until she could no longer bear it alone. On the fifth night, as darkness fell and the figure materialized once again on the beach, Emma grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called Margaret, her voice breaking as she tried to explain what was happening. The elderly woman's response was immediate and sharp. "Lock the doors. Do not go outside. I am coming now." Margaret arrived within 15 minutes, her face pale with worry and something that looked like guilt, and she carried with her a rolling pin gripped in her weathered hands like a weapon, her usually kind eyes hard with protective fury. Margaret stayed with Emma that night, the two women sitting together in the living room with every light blazing, and in the morning the elderly woman made a confession that explained her pallor and her guilt. She had seen the watcher too, had noticed the figure on previous evenings, but had convinced herself it was her imagination, her old eyes playing tricks in the fog, because admitting the truth meant admitting that the danger she had feared for 13 years had finally arrived. They searched the beach together in daylight and found more evidence, footprints in the sand that were too large to be Emma's, more cigarette butts of an expensive brand, and disturbed rocks near the path as if someone had been testing the approach to the house, learning its access points and vulnerabilities. Margaret's fear was palpable and real, and she insisted on staying another night, on not leaving Emma alone with whatever threat lurked in the fog. But Emma needed answers more than she needed protection, and she returned to the hidden study with renewed urgency, determined to find everything her father had left for her. It was among the last stack of papers, buried beneath technical reports and correspondence, that Emma found the journal, a leather-bound book no larger than her hand, its cover worn smooth by handling, and secured with a small brass lock that had no keyhole she could see, just a decorative mechanism that refused to yield to her pulling and prying. The journal was clearly personal, not part of the official research, and the fact that her father had locked it suggested contents too dangerous or too precious to leave accessible. Emma searched the hidden study thoroughly, looking for the key among the papers and boxes, but found nothing, and frustration built in her chest until she wanted to scream. But then she remembered the bedroom that had been prepared for her, the room filled with clothes and objects meant for a young woman, and she wondered if perhaps her father had hidden the key somewhere he knew only she would eventually look, somewhere connected to her childhood self. She went to her old bedroom and began a methodical search, opening drawers and examining every object, and it was in the back of the closet, tucked inside a small wooden box painted with flowers, that she found it, a silver locket on a delicate chain, tarnished with age but still beautiful. The locket opened with a soft click, and inside, pressed into the tiny space where a photograph might go, was a key so small it seemed almost like a piece of jewelry itself, its brass surface matching the lock on the journal perfectly. Emma's hands trembled as she returned to the study and fitted the key into the mechanism, and the lock sprang open with a sound like a sigh of relief, as if it had been waiting 13 years for this moment. The journal opened to reveal pages covered in her father's handwriting, but this was not the careful, measured script of his research notes. This was writing done in desperate haste, the letters slanting and uneven, the ink sometimes smeared as if his hand had been shaking or tears had fallen on the page. The first entry was dated 2 days before the night Emma's parents died, and it began with words that made her heart clench. They know. Carver knows what I have discovered, and he has made it clear that silence is not negotiable. I have documentation of everything, the unauthorized trials, the deaths they covered up, the people whose minds they destroyed in pursuit of a technology that should never exist. But documentation means nothing if I am dead and Emma is used as leverage against me. Sarah and I have made a decision. If we cannot survive this, we will ensure Emma does. The treatment we developed, the ethical version that heals rather than controls, I will use it on Emma myself. I will lock away her memories of this night, of everything she might witness, and I will hide her where even Carver cannot find her. My daughter will forget me, forget her mother, forget the life we shared, but she will live. And someday, when she is strong enough, when she is old enough to fight back, the truth will find her again. I have built fail-safes, left clues, prepared this house as a sanctuary. Emma, if you are reading this, it means you survived and you came home. I am so proud of you. I am so sorry for what I had to do, but know that everything, every terrible choice, was made out of love. Emma read through the night, her father's words painting a picture of idealism corrupted and hope turned to horror, and with each page the full scope of the tragedy that had destroyed her family became brutally clear. David Whitmore had joined Meridian Biotech 7 years before his death, recruited specifically because of his groundbreaking research into trauma therapy and memory consolidation. And he had been given resources beyond anything available in academic settings, state-of-the-art laboratories, unlimited funding, and a team of brilliant researchers who shared his passion for helping people heal from psychological wounds that traditional therapy could not reach. Together with Sarah, who had joined the project as chief medical consultant, they had developed something revolutionary. A treatment protocol that combined carefully calibrated pharmaceutical intervention with advanced cognitive therapy, allowing trauma victims to process their memories without being destroyed by them, to integrate their experiences without losing themselves to pain. The early trials had been miraculous, her father wrote, his handwriting here still steady and filled with professional pride. Patients who had suffered for decades from PTSD, from abuse-related trauma, from memories so devastating they could not function, had found relief and healing, had reclaimed their lives from the prison of their own minds. But then the corporate leadership changed, and a man named Dr. Philip Carver was appointed as Director of Research Operations, and everything began to shift in ways that David found increasingly troubling. Carver was brilliant but ruthless, more interested in the potential applications of memory manipulation than in healing, and he began pushing for expanded trials that skirted the edges of medical ethics and then crossed them entirely. Emma's father documented it all in his journal. Homeless populations used as test subjects without proper consent. Prisoners offered reduced sentences in exchange for participating in experiments that were far more invasive than they understood. Psychiatric patients who could not legally consent being enrolled in trials that erased memories selectively, testing whether the technology could be weaponized, whether it could make people forget crimes they had witnessed or loyalties they had held. David confronted Carver, threatened to go to the regulatory authorities, to expose the violations publicly, and the retaliation was swift and terrifying. Threats against his family, his career, his freedom. The journal entries became increasingly desperate as David realized he was trapped, that Meridian's reach extended into law enforcement, into government oversight, into the very agencies that should have protected the public from corporate malfeasance. And then he discovered why they would never let him leave, why his knowledge made him an existential threat. Emma herself was the key to everything. The treatment protocol he and Sarah had developed relied on specific genetic markers, receptors in the brain that made individuals susceptible to the therapeutic compounds. But Emma lacked those markers entirely, was naturally immune to the memory manipulation techniques, and her genetic profile might hold the secret to creating a treatment that could work on anyone, even those who were resistant. Carver wanted access to Emma, wanted to study her, use her, and David knew with absolute certainty that his daughter would become a lab experiment if he did not act. The final entry, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible, bore the date of the night Emma's parents died, and the words were etched into the page with such force the pen had torn through in places. They will come for Emma tonight. Carver gave me one last chance to cooperate, to hand over my research and my daughter. I refused. Sarah and I have prepared everything. The treatment is ready. I will give it to Emma myself. Will lock away her memories so completely that even torture could not retrieve them. I must hide her where even I cannot find her, where she will be invisible until she is old enough to fight back. The mind can forget what the heart still knows. My darling girl, forgive me. Emma sat at the kitchen table as dawn broke over the ocean. Her father's journal closed in front of her, her mind reeling from the revelations and the terrible choice her parents had made to save her by erasing her. Margaret had fallen asleep in the armchair by the fireplace, exhausted from her vigil, and the house was quiet except for the eternal sound of waves and the cry of gulls greeting the morning. Emma rose on unsteady legs and moved to the window, looking out over the rocks and the endless gray expanse of the Atlantic. And as she stood there, the angle of the light changed, the sun breaking through a bank of clouds to illuminate the water in a particular way, golden and shimmering, and something in her mind shifted violently. It was not a thought but a sensation, a door opening in a place that had been sealed, and suddenly she was 5 years old again, standing at this same window on a night that had started like any other but ended in blood and terror. The memory came not as a gentle recollection, but as an assault, a visceral reliving so complete that Emma gasped and staggered backward, her hand gripping the counter for support as the present dissolved and the past consumed her. She could smell it first, that particular combination of her mother's lavender perfume and the wood smoke from the fireplace, could hear the sound of her father's voice reading her a bedtime story, his deep, reassuring tones making even scary tales feel safe. And then the smell changed, became sharp and chemical, and her mother's voice rose in alarm, calling for David with an urgency that turned Emma's small body cold with instinctive fear. She remembered her father rushing into her bedroom, his face pale and frightened in a way she had never seen before. Remembered him scooping her up without explanation and carrying her quickly down the stairs as her mother's voice escalated from alarm to terror, screaming words Emma's child mind could not fully process. "They are here, David, they are here." She remembered her father setting her down in the living room, his hands shaking as he pried up a section of the hardwood floor that had always been there but that Emma had never known was removable, revealing a narrow space beneath, a hiding place prepared for exactly this moment. She remembered his face as he looked at her, tears streaming down his cheeks, remembered him whispering, "I love you, Emma. I love you so much. You must be very quiet now, as quiet as a mouse. Do not make a sound no matter what you hear. Promise me." And she had promised, had let him lower her into that dark, cramped space, had felt the floorboards being replaced above her head, sealing her into a tomb of wood and earth and darkness. She remembered lying there, her small body trembling with fear as the sounds above her became chaos and violence. Her mother screaming, not in alarm now but in pain and desperation, glass shattering, heavy footsteps of multiple people moving through the house, deep male voices demanding answers, her father's voice rising in defiance, and then cutting off with a terrible wet sound that Emma's mind could not interpret, but her body understood as death. She remembered the strangers searching the house, their footsteps passing directly over her hiding place, their voices discussing her specifically. "Where is the girl? Find the girl. Carver wants her alive." She remembered holding her breath, pressing her hands over her mouth to keep from sobbing, waiting in the darkness as the search continued for hours, and then suddenly, nothing. The memory cut off as if severed by a knife, and Emma found herself on her knees on the kitchen floor in the present, her body convulsing with sobs, her hands pressed to her mouth exactly as they had been 13 years ago. And the truth of what she had witnessed, what her father's treatment had locked away to protect her sanity, crashed over her with the force of a tidal wave, drowning her in grief and rage, and a desperate, burning need for justice. Margaret woke to the sound of Emma's sobs, her elderly eyes snapping open with alarm, and she rushed to the kitchen to find the young woman on the floor, trembling and broken, her face wet with tears and her breath coming in gasping, desperate heaves. The old woman tried to comfort her, to lift her up, but Emma pulled away violently, her eyes blazing with something that had not been there before, a fierce knowing that transformed her from confused victim to accuser. "You knew," Emma said, her voice raw and shaking but filled with steel. "You knew everything, and you let me walk into this house blind. Let me discover it piece by piece instead of telling me the truth from the beginning." Margaret's face crumpled, her own tears starting, but Emma would not be deterred by sympathy or guilt. "I remember now. I remember that night. I was there, Margaret. I was in this house when they came, when they killed my parents. I heard my mother screaming. I heard my father die. Tell me everything, right now, or I swear I will never trust another word you say." The old woman sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight, her weathered hands covering her face. And when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with a grief she had carried for 13 years. "Yes," Margaret whispered. "Yes, Emma, your parents were murdered in this house on the night of October 15th, 13 years ago. Men came in the dark, men sent by Meridian Biotech, and they killed David and Sarah because your father would not give them what they wanted, would not hand over his research or his daughter. But Emma, what you do not know, what you could not know, is what happened after." She looked up, her pale eyes pleading for understanding. "Your father had prepared for this. He knew they might come. Before that night, he had reached out to someone he trusted, a doctor named Henry Chen who had worked with him at Meridian before leaving in disgust over Carver's practices. Henry was waiting nearby, and when the killers finally left the house, when they gave up searching for you and fled into the night, Henry came. He found you 3 days later, still hiding, barely alive, so traumatized you could not speak, could not move, locked inside your own mind by what you had witnessed." Margaret's voice broke, but she continued, the words pouring out as if held back too long. "Henry used your father's own treatment on you, the ethical version designed to help trauma victims survive unbearable memories. He suppressed what you had seen, locked it away where it could not destroy you, and then he did something desperate and brilliant. He created a false identity for you. He admitted you to Riverside Asylum under a different name, claiming you were an orphan found wandering with no identification, no family, suffering from a psychotic break of unknown origin. He hid you in the one place Meridian would never think to look, in plain sight among the mentally ill, protected by patient confidentiality laws and institutional bureaucracy." Emma stared at Margaret, her mind struggling to process this new layer of deception and protection. "The asylum was not a prison," Margaret continued. "It was a sanctuary. Henry monitored you from a distance, ensured you received the best care possible, and waited for the day when you would be old enough, strong enough, to handle the truth. He maintained this house through the trust, kept it ready, and when he died 2 years ago, he passed that responsibility to me. He made me promise to wait, to watch, to be here when you finally came home. Emma, you were never abandoned. You were hidden, protected, loved from afar by people who risked everything to keep you safe from the men who murdered your parents." The confrontation with Margaret had barely ended when they heard a car approaching on the cliff road, its engine a smooth purr that spoke of expensive engineering. Emma moved to the window and saw a sleek black sedan pulling up, and from it emerged a man in an impeccable charcoal suit who looked as though he had stepped out of a corporate boardroom rather than onto a wild Maine beach. He was perhaps in his middle 50s, tall and lean with silver hair perfectly styled, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to power. Margaret's face went ashen at the sight of him, and she gripped Emma's arm with sudden fierce strength. "That is Carver," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Emma, do not let him in." But before Emma could respond, the man was already climbing the porch steps, his knock polite but insistent, the sound of someone who expected to be answered. Emma made a decision driven by the memories now burning in her mind, and a rage that had been building for 13 years in the darkness of her subconscious. She would not hide. She opened the door and faced the man who had ordered her parents' deaths, and she saw his eyes widen fractionally as recognition flickered across his professionally neutral expression. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, extending a hand as if this were a perfectly ordinary social call. "I am Dr. Philip Carver, Vice President of Research Operations at Meridian Biotech. I apologize for the unexpected visit, but I have been trying to locate you for quite some time to discuss a matter of considerable importance." Emma did not take his hand, and after a moment he lowered it, his smile never wavering but something cold flickering behind his pale eyes. "I will be direct," Carver continued, pulling a leather portfolio from his briefcase. "This property and all its contents are legally the property of Meridian Biotech. Your father signed comprehensive contracts granting us ownership of all research materials and intellectual property developed during his tenure. When he absconded with proprietary documents, he committed theft of corporate assets, and this house falls under our legal claim." He opened the portfolio to reveal official documents, covered in legal language and corporate seals. However, Meridian is not interested in protracted legal battles. We understand you have been through a difficult time, and we are prepared to be generous. We are offering you $500,000 in exchange for your immediate vacation of the property and your signature on documents transferring all rights and releasing all claims against the company. This is substantially more than this property is worth, and it comes with the understanding that you will not pursue any further investigation into your father's employment or the circumstances of his death. His smile was perfectly practiced, professionally sympathetic, but his eyes were ice, and Emma could see in them the same ruthless calculation that had sent men to murder her parents, the same cold assessment of human beings as obstacles to be removed or assets to be acquired. "No," Emma said, and the word came out strong and clear, surprising even herself with its conviction. Carver's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tension that suggested the pleasant mask was becoming harder to maintain. "I understand you may need time to consider," he said carefully, "but I would encourage you to think very seriously about this offer, Miss Whitmore. The alternative paths available to you are considerably less pleasant." Carver left with a final warning disguised as concern, his sleek sedan disappearing down the cliff road like a shark sliding back into deep water, and for the rest of that day the house felt different, charged with a tension that made the air itself seem heavy and oppressive. Margaret begged Emma to come stay with her, to leave Tidecrest until they could figure out what to do, but Emma refused, her jaw set with a stubbornness that reminded the old woman painfully of Sarah Whitmore. That night, as Emma sat in the hidden study reading more of her father's research, her phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet house. She answered it to find only silence on the other end, a breathing presence that said nothing but communicated threat as clearly as words. The call came again an hour later, and then again at midnight, and each time Emma answered there was only that silence, that patient, malevolent waiting, until finally she stopped answering and let the phone ring into the darkness. The next morning she discovered her car, the old sedan she had purchased with the last of her meager Asylum savings, sitting on 4 flat tires, each one deliberately slashed with a knife that had left clean, precise cuts in the rubber. The message was clear: you are vulnerable, you are watched, you can be reached. Margaret arrived to find Emma staring at the ruined tires, her face pale but her eyes blazing with anger rather than fear, and the old woman's pleas became more urgent, more desperate. "Emma, please, this is how it starts. They are testing you, seeing if you can be frightened into compliance. Next, it will be worse. Your parents did not die so you could throw your life away on revenge or stubborn pride." But Emma shook her head, her voice quiet but absolutely certain. "They died protecting me and protecting the truth. I will not dishonor that by running away. This is my home, Margaret. This is my inheritance. And if Carver wants me gone badly enough to threaten me, it means there is something here he desperately needs to hide." The escalation continued with methodical precision over the following days. More silent phone calls at all hours, disrupting Emma's sleep and fraying her nerves. Her mailbox smashed and mail scattered across the rocks. Dead fish left on her porch, their rotting smell a visceral assault, and always the sense of being watched, of eyes tracking her every movement from the fog and the beach and the road. But it was what happened on the 5th night after Carver's visit that transformed Emma's resolve into something harder and more dangerous. She woke in the darkness to a sound that did not belong, a soft creak from the floor below, and she lay frozen in her bed as she heard footsteps moving through the house, not bothering to be quiet, confident in their intrusion. Someone was inside, searching, and Emma could hear drawers being opened, furniture being moved, the distinct sound of the hidden study being ransacked. She wanted to call for help, to hide as she had hidden as a child, but instead she found herself rising from the bed, gripping the heavy iron poker from the fireplace that she had taken to keeping beside her, and moving silently down the stairs. By the time she reached the attic, the intruder was gone, escaped through a window that had been forced open, but the damage was clear. Her father's study had been thoroughly searched. Files pulled from shelves, papers scattered across the floor, the desk drawers emptied. They had been looking for something specific, and Emma's hands shook with rage as she surveyed the violation. When Margaret arrived at dawn, summoned by Emma's call, and saw the destruction and the young woman's determined face, she knew that no argument would move her. Emma would not leave, would not surrender, and the battle that had claimed her parents 13 years ago was now truly joined. The morning after the break-in, as Emma stood on the porch surveying the damage to her sense of security and trying to decide what to do next, a battered pickup truck pulled up to the house, and a man climbed out, moving with the easy, unhurried grace of someone who spent his life working on the water. He was perhaps in his late 20s, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, dressed in worn jeans and a heavy canvas work jacket that smelled of salt and fish. Margaret emerged from inside the house where she had been helping Emma restore order to the ransacked study, and her face lit up with relief and something like hope when she saw him. "Ben," she called out, hurrying down the steps with more energy than Emma had seen from her in days. "Thank God you came." The man, Ben, embraced his grandmother gently, his weathered hands careful on her thin shoulders, and then his gaze moved to Emma, and she saw in his dark eyes a combination of curiosity, sympathy, and something deeper, something that looked like shared grief and understanding. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet and rough, the voice of someone who did not waste words. "I am Ben Brennan, Margaret's grandson. I have been away working the fishing boats up north, but my grandmother called me last night and told me what has been happening here. I came as soon as I could." He climbed the steps to stand before her, and Emma saw that he was perhaps 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders built by years of hauling nets and fighting the sea. And there was a steadiness about him, a calm competence that reminded her painfully of the father she could barely remember. "I knew your parents," Ben continued, his gaze direct and honest. "I was 15 when they died, just a kid helping my father with odd jobs around town. Your dad hired us to do some work on this house one summer, repairs to the foundation and the porch. He was kind to me, treated me like I mattered, not just cheap labor. Your mother made us lemonade and sat with us during breaks, asking about my school and my dreams like she genuinely cared. They were good people, Emma, and what happened to them was not an accident or a tragedy. It was murder, and the people responsible have never been held accountable." His jaw tightened, and Emma saw anger flash in his eyes, old and deep and personal. "My father, Thomas Brennan, he worked briefly for Meridian Biotech about 8 years ago, doing maintenance and security work at their research facility down the coast. He saw things there, things that troubled him deeply, and he started asking questions, talking to people, trying to understand what kind of experiments they were running. 3 months into the job, he died in what they called a boating accident. His body found washed up on the rocks with a head injury they said came from falling and hitting the gunwale during rough seas." Ben's voice was steady, but Emma could hear the pain beneath it. "Carefully controlled, but never forgotten. My father was the best fisherman in Saltmere Cove. He could navigate these waters blind in a storm. He did not fall and hit his head in calm weather on a routine fishing trip. He was murdered, just like your parents, and Meridian covered it up just like they covered up everything else. I have spent years trying to prove it, collecting evidence, talking to other families who lost people connected to that company, but I am just a fisherman with no resources and no power. They have lawyers and money and connections that go all the way to the state capitol." He looked at Emma with an intensity that was almost physical. "But you, Emma, you have something I do not have. You have your father's research, his documentation, his proof. And you have the legal right to be in this house, to access what he left behind. If you are willing to fight, if you are willing to risk what your parents risked, then I am willing to help you. I can protect you, watch the house, make sure Carver's people think twice before they come back. And together, maybe we can do what our parents could not, expose the truth and make Meridian pay for every life they have destroyed." Margaret stood beside her grandson, tears streaming down her weathered face, and she nodded at Emma with an expression that was both fearful and fiercely proud. Emma looked at Ben, at this man who had lost his father to the same evil that had taken her parents, who had spent years alone in his grief and his quest for justice, and she felt something shift inside her, a terrible isolation beginning to crack. She was not alone anymore. Ben moved into the house that same day, setting up a makeshift camp in one of the spare bedrooms, and his presence brought a sense of security that Emma had not realized she desperately needed. The knowledge that someone was watching the doors and windows while she slept, that she was not facing the darkness alone. Together they began a methodical search of the house, looking for anything Emma's father might have hidden, any evidence beyond what was already in the study. And it was Ben who suggested they examine the fireplace more closely, noting that the stonework seemed newer than the rest of the house, as if it had been rebuilt or reinforced at some point. They worked together in the living room, Emma holding a flashlight while Ben ran his hands over each stone, testing for movement or irregularities, and after nearly an hour of painstaking examination he found it. A stone near the base of the hearth, just to the left of where the fire burned, that shifted slightly under pressure. It took both of them working together to pry it loose, their fingers scraping against the rough surface until finally it came free, revealing a dark cavity behind it, and within that space, a small fireproof safe with a combination lock, its metal surface cool and untouched by the heat that had burned in the hearth for 13 years. The safe was not large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, but it was heavy and secure, and Emma stared at the numbered dial with a sinking feeling, realizing that without the combination they had found nothing but another locked door. But then she remembered something from her father's journal. A seemingly random sequence of numbers he had written in the margin of one page, with no context or explanation, and with trembling hands she retrieved the journal from the study and found the numbers, 6/1987. She spun the dial carefully, the mechanism clicking softly with each rotation, and when she pulled the handle, the safe opened with a sound like a sigh, revealing contents that made both Emma and Ben draw in sharp breaths. Inside were backup copies of everything from the hidden study, printed on special archival paper designed to survive decades, organized in clear protective sleeves. Her father's research notes, technical documentation of Project Tidebreak, internal Meridian Biotech communications, showing full knowledge of the illegal trials and the deaths that resulted, and most damning of all, financial records spanning 15 years that detailed a systematic pattern of payments to government officials, medical examiners, local police departments, and journalists, a web of corruption designed to ensure that questions were never asked and investigations never pursued. There were USB drives containing what appeared to be video and audio recordings, digital backups of everything, and a sealed envelope marked with Emma's name in her father's handwriting. But it was the final document that made Emma's blood run cold. A single sheet of paper that had been handled so many times the edges were worn soft, titled simply, Project Tidebreak Personnel. It was a list of names, perhaps 30 people, each followed by their role in the project: research scientists, medical doctors, technicians, administrative staff, all the people who had worked on the memory manipulation program and who knew the truth about what Meridian had done. And next to almost every name was a date and a single word written in red ink: deceased. Ben read the list over Emma's shoulder, his breath coming faster as he recognized some of the names. People from the area, people whose deaths had been explained as accidents or natural causes or suicides, a pattern of tragedy that had never seemed connected until now. Dr. Robert Chen, neurologist, deceased August 2012. Dr. Lisa Morrison, clinical psychologist, deceased March 2013. James Hartley, lab technician, deceased November 2014. The list went on, a roster of the dead, and Emma felt bile rise in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. Meridian had systematically eliminated everyone who could testify against them, everyone who knew the truth. A purge that had taken years but had been thorough and ruthless. At the bottom of the list, written in her father's hand but added later in different ink, were 3 final names: Dr. David Whitmore, deceased October 2015. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, deceased October 2015. And then, in ink that looked fresher than the rest, as if added at the very last moment, Emma Whitmore, with no date beside it but instead a question mark. Uncertainty and terrible hope combined in a single punctuation mark. Her father's final acknowledgement that he did not know if his desperate plan would save her or merely delay her execution. They had only 2 days to document and organize the evidence before Carver returned, but this time he did not come alone, and he did not bother with polite pretense or corporate offers. Emma and Ben heard the vehicles approaching in the late afternoon. Not 1 car but 3. And when they looked out the window they saw Carver emerging from the lead vehicle accompanied by 2 men who looked nothing like corporate executives and everything like the kind of people hired to do work that left no witnesses. The men were large and hard-faced, wearing dark suits that bulged slightly under the arms in ways that suggested concealed weapons, and they moved with the coordinated purpose of professionals as they approached the house. Ben moved immediately to stand between Emma and the door, his body tense and ready. But before either of them could decide what to do, the door burst inward with a crash of splintering wood, the lock giving way under a single brutal kick, and Carver walked in flanked by his associates, his professional mask completely dropped to reveal the cold, ruthless predator beneath. "Where is it?" Carver demanded, his voice sharp and stripped of all pretense. Your father's research, the backup files, the evidence. I know it is here, and you will give it to me now." When Emma did not answer, merely stood her ground with Ben beside her, Carver nodded to his men, and they moved through the house like a destructive force of nature, overturning furniture, ripping books from shelves, smashing anything that might conceal a hiding place. Ben stepped forward to intervene, grabbing one of the men by the arm, and the response was immediate and violent. The associate spun and threw a punch that caught Ben in the jaw, sending him staggering backward. But Ben was a fisherman who had spent his life hauling nets and fighting the sea, and he recovered quickly, launching himself at the man with a roar of rage, and suddenly the living room erupted into chaos as the two men grappled and crashed into furniture, trading blows with brutal efficiency. The second associate moved toward Emma, his intention clear in his cold eyes, reaching for her with hands meant to restrain or threaten. But something happened in Emma's mind, something unlocked by the adrenaline and the danger. And suddenly she was moving in ways her conscious mind did not understand, but her body remembered perfectly. Her father had trained her, she realized with shock even as her body acted on instinct, had taught her basic self-defense and combat techniques during the months before his death, preparation for exactly this kind of threat. And though the memories were locked away, the physical knowledge remained, written into muscle and reflex. She ducked under the man's reaching hands and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with precise force, exactly where her father's ghost voice whispered it would do maximum damage, and when he doubled over gasping, she brought her knee up into his face with a crack of breaking cartilage. The associate stumbled backward, blood streaming from his nose, shock and pain warring in his expression as he looked at this slim young woman who had just taken him down with professional efficiency. Emma's hands were shaking, but her stance was solid, balanced, ready, and she saw Carver's eyes widen with something like recognition as he reassessed the threat she represented. "She has been trained," he said to himself, his voice filled with a mixture of surprise and vindication. "David taught her. The immune response extends to physical conditioning. Muscle memory that survives the therapeutic erasure." The two associates, both now battered and one bleeding heavily, regrouped beside Carver, their earlier confidence replaced with wary respect. And Ben stood protectively beside Emma, his own face bruised and bleeding, but his eyes blazing with fierce pride. Carver backed toward the door, his expression shifting from rage to calculated assessment. "This is not over, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice returning to its controlled corporate tone. "You have assaulted Meridian employees in the course of their lawful repossession of stolen property. I will return with law enforcement and legal injunctions, and this house and everything in it will be seized through proper channels. You have 24 hours to reconsider my generous offer before I destroy you through the courts." After Carver and his men left, Ben secured the shattered door as best he could while Emma stood in the wreckage of the living room, her body still trembling from the adrenaline and the shock of discovering skills she did not remember learning. The fight had dislodged something in her mind, cracked open doors that had been sealed, and she moved through the damaged house in a daze, drawn by an instinct she could not name toward her childhood bedroom. On the floor, knocked from the dresser during the ransacking, lay a small wooden music box painted with delicate roses, its lacquered surface scratched but intact, and when Emma picked it up, something in her chest constricted with recognition so powerful it was almost pain. This had been her mother's, she knew with absolute certainty, a treasure from Sarah's own childhood that she had kept on her dresser and sometimes, on special nights, would wind up to play its delicate melody while Emma drifted off to sleep. Emma's fingers found the key on the bottom of the box and turned it slowly, and as the first notes of the lullaby chimed out, thin and sweet and achingly familiar, the final walls in her mind shattered completely, and the memory came flooding back with a completeness that was both devastating and liberating. She was 5 years old again, sitting on her bed in her nightgown, and her father was kneeling before her, his face wet with tears as he held a syringe filled with clear liquid, the treatment he had developed to save trauma victims now being used on his own daughter. "This will help you forget the bad things, Emma," he was saying, his voice breaking. "It will keep you safe. But before I give this to you, I need you to remember something for me, something important. Can you do that?" And little Emma had nodded, not understanding but trusting completely, and her father had taken her small hand and pressed something into it, a USB drive no bigger than her thumb. "This is the truth, sweetheart. This is the proof of what Meridian did, everything they tried to hide. I am going to put it somewhere very special, somewhere only you will think to look when you are older. Your music box, the one Mommy loves. Do you know where she keeps it?" Emma had pointed to her mother's dresser, and her father had hidden the drive there, his hands shaking, before returning to kneel before his daughter one final time. Then the memory shifted, became darker and more terrible, and Emma relived the hiding beneath the floorboards, but now she saw more, remembered more. She heard her mother's voice above the chaos, strong and defiant even as footsteps pursued her through the house. "You will not touch my daughter. You will have to kill me first." And then a man's voice, cold and familiar even 13 years later, saying, "That can be arranged, Doctor." Whitmore. A gunshot. Her mother's scream cut short, and then her father's roar of grief and rage. Emma heard the struggle, heard her father fighting desperately against multiple attackers, heard his voice weakening as he called out final words meant for her hiding place. "Emma, you are stronger than you know. You are stronger than all of them." And then the terrible wet sounds of violence, of a man being beaten and stabbed, and finally silence broken only by heavy breathing and footsteps. Through the cracks in the floorboards, little Emma had seen them, seen the killers standing over her father's body, and one of them had knelt down, his face visible in the lamplight, and it was a face she now knew intimately. Dr. Philip Carver, younger by 13 years but unmistakable, his hands covered in blood, his expression one of cold satisfaction. "Search the house," he had ordered. "Find the girl and find the research. Leave nothing." But they had not found her, and eventually they had fled, and Emma had remained in that dark space for 3 days, silent and still, until Henry Chen had come and pulled her broken mind from the wreckage. Emma came back to the present on her knees on the bedroom floor, the music box still playing its innocent melody, and she was crying, but she was also smiling because now she knew everything, remembered everything, and the final piece of evidence her father had hidden was exactly where he had told her it would be, waiting in her mother's music box for the day when she would be strong enough to use it. Emma pried open the music box with shaking hands and found the USB drive exactly where her father had hidden it 13 years ago, nestled in the velvet lining beneath the musical mechanism, and when she showed it to Ben and Margaret, their faces reflected the same mixture of hope and fear that she felt burning in her chest. They gathered at the kitchen table as night fell outside, the damaged house locked and barricaded as best they could manage, and they began to plan their counterattack with the desperate focus of people who knew they had one chance and no margin for error. Margaret, despite her age and fear, proved to be surprisingly tactical, suggesting they could not simply go to local authorities who might be compromised by Meridian's money, could not trust that any single newspaper or agency would publish the evidence before being pressured into silence. "We need to release everything at once," she said, her weathered hands steady as she wrote notes on a pad of paper. "Every major news outlet, every investigative journalism organization, every regulatory agency and congressional oversight committee, all simultaneously so they cannot suppress it or spin the narrative before the truth gets out." Ben nodded, his fisherman's practical mind already working through logistics. "I have a friend in Portland, works in IT, owes me favors. He can help us set up a simultaneous mass email, maybe even get it to some of those investigative reporters who specialize in corporate corruption. But we need everything organized, packaged in a way that makes the story clear and impossible to ignore." Emma inserted the USB drive into her laptop with hands that trembled with exhaustion and determination, and what she found there made her breath catch. Video files, dozens of them, recorded testimony from her father and mother explaining their research, their discovery of Meridian's crimes, and their fear for their lives. Her father's face filled the screen, younger and alive and so achingly familiar that Emma had to pause the playback and collect herself before continuing. "If you are watching this," her father's recorded voice said, "it means Sarah and I are gone and Emma has found what we left for her. The evidence on this drive is damning but incomplete, the full proof. The video footage of the illegal trials, the recorded confessions of subjects who were harmed, the internal Meridian communications approving the experiments, all of it exists on a secure server that I buried on the property. I could not risk keeping it in the house where it might be found and destroyed, so I hid it where only Emma would think to look, in a place connected to her innocent joy before all this darkness touched our lives." The video showed her father's face turning toward the camera with an expression of profound love and sorrow. "Emma, sweetheart, if you are watching this, look at your drawings, the ones you made that last summer. You drew a treasure map for your birthday treasure hunt, remember? You drew where I hid your presents in the garden, The real treasure is buried in the same place, under the stone with the starfish you painted. You were so proud of that starfish, my clever girl. Emma's heart lurched because she did remember now, remembered that summer before everything ended, remembered drawing elaborate maps with crayons, showing where her birthday treasures were hidden, remembered painting a flat beach stone with a bright orange starfish and placing it in the garden as a marker. She raced upstairs to her childhood bedroom, Ben and Margaret following, and there on the wall beside her bed were her drawings, still pinned exactly where her mother had put them years ago, preserved like artifacts in a museum. One drawing showed the house and the garden with a large X marked beneath a tree, and beside the X was a carefully drawn orange starfish. The lighthouse garden. Emma breathed, remembering the small plot her mother had cultivated on the sheltered side of the old lighthouse foundation, a place where wildflowers somehow managed to grow despite the salt wind and rocky soil. That is where my father buried the server. That is where the final evidence is hidden. They waited until deep night to begin their excavation, not wanting to risk being seen by watchers who might still be monitoring the property. And the three of them moved through the darkness with only a single shuttered lantern to guide their way, carrying shovels and tools Ben had retrieved from his truck. The old lighthouse stood like a pale ghost against the star-filled sky, its abandoned bulk providing shelter from the wind, and on its eastern side, protected from the worst of the coastal weather, Emma found the remnants of what had once been her mother's garden, now overgrown with wild beach grass and struggling roses that had somehow survived 13 years of neglect. She searched the ground by lantern light, looking for the marker she had placed as a child, and there, half buried in soil and sand, was the flat beach stone she had painted with such care, its orange starfish faded but still visible, a connection to her younger self that made her throat tighten with emotion. Ben began to dig where Emma indicated, his strong arms driving the shovel into the rocky soil with steady determination, and Margaret kept watch, her elderly eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of approaching danger. The digging was slow work, the ground resistant and filled with rocks that had to be pried loose and set aside, but Ben worked with the patient persistence of a man accustomed to hard labor, and gradually a hole took shape, growing deeper and wider, until his shovel struck something that rang with a hollow metallic sound. Emma dropped to her knees beside the excavation, her hands joining Ben's as they cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal a large waterproof case, the kind used by military and emergency services to protect sensitive equipment, its surface scratched and weathered but its seals intact. They pulled it from the ground together, the weight of it significant, and carried it back to the house where they could examine it in safety and light. Inside the kitchen, with every door locked and every window covered, Emma opened the latches on the case and lifted the lid to reveal contents that represented her father's final desperate act of defiance and hope. 3 ruggedized hard drives in protective cases, each labeled with dates and categories, a portable server unit designed to operate independently, and a sealed package marked with Emma's name in her father's handwriting. Ben immediately began examining the hard drives, connecting them to Emma's laptop to verify their contents, and his face grew grim as he navigated through folder after folder of video files, audio recordings, scanned documents, and photographic evidence showing the full scope of Meridian's crimes spanning more than a decade. "This is everything," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe and horror. "Every illegal trial, every subject who was harmed, every internal memo approving the experiments, every payment made to cover it up. This is enough to bring down the entire company and put Carver in prison for the rest of his life." But Emma was focused on the sealed package, her hands trembling as she tore it open to find a USB drive and a handwritten letter on her father's personal stationery, dated October 14th, 13 years ago, the night before he died. The letter was brief, written in her father's familiar script but with an urgency that made the pen strokes harsh and deep. "My dearest Emma, if you are reading this, you have found your way home and you have become the strong, brave young woman I always knew you would be. I am so proud of you. I am recording this final message tonight because tomorrow Carver comes, and I know I will not survive what is coming. But you will survive, my darling girl, because the truth lives in you, in your very cells, in your immunity to their poison. You are the proof they can never erase, the witness they can never silence. Use what I have left you, expose them, make them pay for every life they have destroyed, and know that your mother and I loved you more than words can express. You are our hope, our future, our triumph over darkness. Be strong, Emma. The truth lives in you, always. Emma inserted the final USB drive with tears streaming down her face, and her father's face appeared on the screen, sitting in the hidden study she now knew so well. His eyes red from crying, but his voice steady and clear as he spoke directly to her across 13 years of silence and loss, telling her everything she needed to know to finish what he had started. They had only begun to organize the evidence for mass distribution when the headlights appeared on the cliff road. Not 3 vehicles this time, but 7. A convoy of black SUVs that surrounded the property with military precision, and Emma knew immediately that Carver had decided subtlety and legal pretense were no longer necessary. Through the windows they could see men emerging from the vehicles, at least a dozen of them, all wearing dark tactical clothing and moving with coordinated purpose that spoke of professional training. And these were not corporate security guards but hired mercenaries, the kind of people who asked no questions and left no witnesses. Ben moved to barricade the door while Margaret called the local police, but they all knew help would not arrive in time, that Carver had chosen this moment deliberately, deep night when response times were slowest and isolation most complete. A bullhorn crackled to life outside, Carver's voice amplified and stripped of all corporate civility. Emma Whitmore, you have 30 seconds to bring me the evidence and surrender yourself, or we will enter the house by force. There is nowhere to run. You cannot win this. Emma stood frozen in the kitchen, her father's final video still playing on the laptop screen, his face telling her to be strong, to expose the truth, and in that moment a clarity descended on her that felt almost supernatural, a certainty about what she had to do. Ben, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. How fast can you upload files to the internet? Ben looked at her, confusion and then understanding dawning on his weathered face. If I use multiple cloud services simultaneously, compress the files, maybe 10 minutes for everything. But Emma, they will break in before, then we don't wait. Emma interrupted, and she was already moving, setting up her phone on a stack of books to face her, opening social media apps and streaming platforms. Her fingers flying across the screen with desperate speed. We go live right now. We broadcast everything in real time. They can't kill us or destroy the evidence if the whole world is watching. Margaret's eyes widened with understanding and fierce pride, and she moved to help Ben begin the upload process, copying files to every cloud service they could access, sending them to every news outlet whose email they could find, while Emma positioned herself in front of the camera and took a deep breath. Outside, Carver's voice was counting down, 30 seconds becoming 20, becoming 10, and Emma could hear the sound of men approaching the house, preparing to breach. But she was no longer afraid because she finally understood what her father had meant, that the truth lived in her and could not be silenced. She pressed the button to start the live stream and began to speak, her voice clear and strong, her eyes looking directly into the camera lens as if she could see the faces of everyone who would watch. My name is Emma Whitmore. 13 years ago, when I was 5 years old, my parents were murdered in this house by men hired by Meridian Biotech, a corporation that has been conducting illegal human experiments for over a decade. I witnessed their deaths. I survived only because my father used his own experimental treatment to lock away my memories and hide me where the killers could not find me. I have spent 5 years in a psychiatric institution, my past erased, my identity stolen, while the people responsible for my parents' murders walked free. But I remember now. I remember everything. And I have the proof. She held up one of the hard drives, showing it to the camera, and behind her, Ben worked frantically to upload files while simultaneously sharing Emma's live stream across every platform he could access. Dr. Philip Carver, Vice President of Meridian Biotech, is outside this house right now with armed men, trying to kill me and destroy the evidence of his crimes. But you are watching. The world is watching. And the truth cannot be buried anymore. The live stream counter was climbing, dozens of viewers becoming hundreds, becoming thousands, as the feed was shared and reshared, and Emma continued speaking, naming names, showing documents to the camera, playing clips from her father's final video testimony. Outside, she heard Carver's voice again, but different now, uncertain, and through the window she saw him on his phone, his face contorted with rage and growing panic as he realized what she had done. That killing her now would be murder witnessed by thousands of people across the world, that the evidence was already spreading beyond his ability to contain it. The sound of sirens cut through the night like salvation, multiple vehicles approaching from both directions on the cliff road, And through the window, Emma could see the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers and unmarked federal vehicles converging on Tidecrest House with a speed that suggested someone with real authority had been watching her live stream and understood the urgency of the situation. Carver's men began to scatter, some fleeing toward their vehicles while others simply dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Professional mercenaries recognizing when a mission had failed catastrophically and self-preservation became the only rational choice. Carver himself stood frozen in the glare of approaching headlights, his phone pressed to his ear as he screamed at someone on the other end, his carefully constructed world of corporate power and protected crimes collapsing around him in real time. Emma's live stream had been shared more than 50,000 times in the 20 minutes since she started broadcasting, picked up by major news networks and independent journalists, trending on every social media platform. And the comment section was filled with thousands of people expressing outrage, demanding justice, tagging law enforcement agencies and elected officials, creating a tidal wave of public attention that no amount of money or influence could suppress. Ben had successfully uploaded the complete evidence to multiple cloud services and sent copies to more than 300 journalists, lawmakers, and regulatory agencies, ensuring that even if Meridian tried to scrub the internet, the truth would survive in too many places to eliminate. The police surrounded Carver and his remaining men with weapons drawn, and Emma watched through the window as federal agents in FBI windbreakers emerged from the unmarked vehicles, their presence indicating that someone in the Bureau had been monitoring Meridian for some time, and Emma's evidence had provided the justification they needed to act. A senior agent approached the house and identified herself through the door as Special Agent Rebecca Torres, asking Emma to come out peacefully so they could secure the scene and take her statement. And when Emma emerged onto the porch with Ben and Margaret beside her, she saw Carver being handcuffed, his expensive suit rumpled and his face pale with the realization that his threats were now empty, that the machinery of justice he had corrupted for so long was finally turning against him. He looked at Emma as the agents led him toward a waiting vehicle, and she saw in his eyes not remorse but rage, the fury of a predator who had been outmaneuvered by prey he had underestimated. Agent Torres was professional but kind, her dark eyes showing genuine respect as she listened to Emma's story, and over the next 4 hours, Emma gave a complete statement in a mobile command center the FBI had set up on the property, her memories now clear and complete, every detail of that terrible night 13 years ago recorded and documented as evidence. She told them about her father's research, about the murdered colleagues, about the systematic elimination of witnesses. And as she spoke, she felt the weight of 13 years of lies and suppression beginning to lift from her shoulders like a physical burden being removed stone by stone. Other agents began the careful process of securing the evidence, cataloging the hard drives and files, treating Tidecrest House as both a crime scene from the past and a repository of proof that would bring down an entire corporation. As dawn broke over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Emma stood on the porch of the house that had always been hers, even when she could not remember it, and she finally understood who she was. Not a broken victim, not a forgotten orphan, but the daughter of heroes who had died protecting the truth, a survivor who had carried that truth in her very cells through years of darkness, and now, finally, a witness whose testimony could not be silenced. The weeks following Carver's arrest unfolded with a momentum that felt almost surreal, as if the dam Emma had broken released not just her own story but a flood of suppressed truth that had been building for years. Meridian Biotech's stock price collapsed within 48 hours of the evidence going public, dropping from $87 per share to less than $3, as investors fled, and trading was eventually suspended pending investigation. The FBI raid on Meridian's headquarters yielded evidence that corroborated everything Emma's father had documented: files on dozens of illegal trials, internal communications showing full knowledge of deaths and injuries, financial records proving a conspiracy that reached into state regulatory agencies and beyond. Dr. Philip Carver was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of David and Sarah Whitmore, along with conspiracy, racketeering, and violations of federal medical ethics laws that could result in life imprisonment without parole. But perhaps most powerful was what happened in the days after Emma's live stream went viral. Families began coming forward, people who had lost loved ones to mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses after those individuals had worked for or interacted with Meridian, people who had been silenced by legal settlements or intimidated into silence by corporate lawyers, People who had carried their grief and suspicion alone for years and now finally saw a path to justice. Ben's mother contacted Emma personally, a woman Emma had never met but who embraced her with tears of gratitude and shared grief, telling her that finally, after 8 years, she would learn the truth about what happened to her husband. Emma found herself at the center of a growing movement of victims and survivors, and rather than being overwhelmed by the responsibility, she felt a sense of purpose that gave shape and meaning to everything she had endured. Working with a team of lawyers who took her case pro bono, drawn by the publicity and the clear righteousness of her cause, Emma established the Whitmore Foundation for Corporate Accountability and Victim Support, an organization dedicated to helping individuals and families harmed by corporate malfeasance navigate the legal system, access mental health resources, and tell their stories without fear of retaliation. The foundation was funded initially by a settlement from Meridian's insurance carriers and later by donations from people across the country who had been moved by Emma's story, and it operated out of a small office in Saltmere Cove, with Emma as its director and public face. Margaret became an invaluable advisor, her years of quiet observation and her connections in the community providing Emma with wisdom and grounding when the attention and pressure became overwhelming. Ben transitioned from fishing to working full-time for the foundation, using his practical skills and his own experience as a victim's family member to help others navigate their grief and their pursuit of justice. The three of them formed a chosen family, bound not by blood but by shared loss and shared purpose, and they gathered regularly around the kitchen table at Tidecrest House to plan the foundation's work and to simply be together, filling the rooms with laughter and conversation and life in a way that honored the memory of those who had died there. The house itself began to transform from a place of secrets and sorrow into a true home. Emma repaired the damage from Carver's intrusions, repainted walls, tended to her mother's garden until it bloomed again with roses and wildflowers, and slowly filled the rooms with her own possessions and her own memories. She kept the photographs of her parents on the mantle, but added new ones, pictures of Margaret and Ben, photos from foundation events, images of the families she had helped, creating a visual record of a life being lived forward rather than trapped in the past. On quiet evenings, Emma would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the ocean, and she would think about her parents and the sacrifice they had made to protect her, and she would feel not just grief but gratitude that their work, their truth, had finally been vindicated, and that their daughter had survived to carry on their legacy of fighting for those who could not fight for themselves. Emma woke before dawn on the anniversary of the day she had first arrived at Tidecrest House, exactly 1 year since she had stood at the gates of Riverside Asylum, clutching a rusted key and wondering if anyone in the world remembered she existed. She dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Ben, who slept in the guest room, or disturb Margaret, who had stayed over the night before, and she walked down to the beach carrying a simple ceramic urn that held the ashes of her parents, finally released to her after the FBI completed their investigation and the murder case against Carver moved toward trial. The ocean was calm, the waves gentle against the rocks, and the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the horizon in shades of lavender and gold that promised a beautiful day. Emma stood at the water's edge, her bare feet in the cold sand, and she opened the urn with steady hands, no longer trembling with grief or fear but strong with purpose and peace. "I did it," she said quietly to the ashes and to the memory of the people who had loved her enough to die protecting her. "I finished what you started. Carver will spend the rest of his life in prison. Meridian is gone, and the foundation is helping people, Mom and Dad. We are making a difference." She scattered the ashes into the waves, watching them catch the morning light before dissolving into the ocean her parents had loved, and she felt not loss but connection, as if they were returning to something eternal and beautiful. Behind her, Tidecrest House stood solid and welcoming on its rocky outcrop, no longer haunted by shadows or secrets but filled with light and purpose and the life she was building. She had decided to stay in Saltmere Cove, to make this place where her story had been stolen, the place where she would write new chapters, surrounded by people who had become her family and engaged in work that gave meaning to everything she had survived. Emma was no longer a girl with no past, but a young woman who carried her history with pride, who understood that the truth her father spoke of did live in her, always, written into her very being. The journey to reclaim herself had transformed her into someone stronger than she had ever imagined, someone her parents would be proud of. And as the sun broke over the horizon and flooded the beach with golden light, Emma smiled because she finally understood what it meant to be home.